Okay, in this video we're going to continue looking at data binding, and the next two controls for data binding. The first one was the access data source. Now you can use SQL data source to connect to access databases, but ASP.NET also provides this access data source control to do it as well. It gives you some specialized access to access databases using the JET data provider, but it still uses SQL commands to perform data retrieval, mainly because it's derived from the SQL data source. One of the specialized parts of this particular control is that it does not require you to set a connection string property. Instead, the control uses a data file property that allows you to directly specify the access MDB database file. Also, because the access data source uses the system data OLEDB to perform actual data access, the order of parameters matters. So you can't just willy-nilly list your parameters. They have to be in the specific order that they were defined in access in the stored procedure. So you need to make sure you verify that order, or the order of parameters, for any select, insert, update, and delete parameters collection matches. Next, we have the linked data source. Now, we're going to go into this in more detail in a few weeks in Chapter 9, so if I gloss over some of this, don't be too concerned about it, because we are going to get into this in more detail. This is just kind of an overview of all the data source controls at this point. The linked data source actually generates queries for data objects in your application by converting its property strings into link queries. Now, one really cool thing about this is you could actually use this links data source to query collections. So it's not just limited to databases, but collections as well, or arrays, if you will, which are nothing more than collections. Okay, we're going to take a look at an example of creating one of these links data sources. But first I want to show you that I've got Chapter 7 open from the book code, and you should know that in the application data folder we actually have a Northwind database file there. So everything in here has been done using a local file as opposed to the SQL Server. The second thing of note because of that is that you will probably want to go in and reconnect to the Northwind database. It's going to be disconnected by default, so if you want to actually see all this stuff go, you're going to want to reconnect by double clicking. Then you've got the connection made from there, so that'll be the first step that you want to take here. Then we're going to, as a sample to get us started here, open up number 7, listing 7, or excuse me, number 9, and it has a links data source already supplied here for us. But the way this was created was in the design phase, and you would merely click on the Smart Task and configure the data source. Here, when you first open it, you're going to have a check mark next to the data context objects. We'll talk more about these in Chapter 9, but it's basically an object that contains the data that you want to query. So by default, when this wizard opens, it only shows those. If you didn't have that clicked, you would get a whole range of different data connections that you could use, and you can see how confusing it might get right away, so we just look at the data context. From there, you can then choose the table that you want to get, as well as which fields you want within that table. If you want to do group by, you could choose that. There's also a where, just like we looked at for the SQL data source, and order by. When you're done, you would just merely click finished, And then if we go back and look at our code for this, you'll see a couple different things. First of all, the context name that we chose, the table name that we chose, and since we're getting everything, it's just we don't have to worry about a select at this point. The one thing I should point out, though, this ID would not be accessible or acceptable to us. You would want something like LDS, and then maybe in this case Northwind Customer, since that seems to be what we were choosing there, but you would want to name this appropriately. You might also notice that the enabled insert, update, and delete are all in here and marked as true. So this is going to allow the user to insert, update, or delete if the underlying data source supports them. So you got to make sure that that is true as well. But because the data source control knows that it is connected to the links to SQL data context object, which by default supports these actions, it automatically enabled them for us. Now, we'll talk about this later in chapter 9, but what we're referring to there is in the application code we have created that links to SQL object that is actually being used, and we did that. The books created a folder, which is a good idea to do, but they did that by adding a new item, and the new item was a links to SQL class, and that creates the DBML file that you see there. And more on that when we get into chapter 9. If you were to choose the specific fields in the linked data source that you just saw where we could have chosen them, the wizard's going to add a select attribute, and we can see that in the example for 710. So in that wizard, had we chosen the actual fields, we would have gotten this select attribute or property as well, where we're creating a new select and we're getting the customer ID, contact name, contact title, and region in this particular case. Now, as you saw, the links data source control also allows you to specify different query parameters such as the where and order by. So if we look at number 11 here, we'll go into the design again and we'll choose the smart task. You will see that a where clause has actually been added here, where the customer ID is equal to a parameter that is being passed in. So that's the parameter, the add customer ID. You should be familiar with that. So what this generates for us when we choose that, it generates first of all a where clause and the original element where the customer ID is equal to add customer ID, which you just saw, but it also creates a where parameter element that actually lists those. So the default value is 0, the name of it is customer ID, the query string ID is, or field is ID, and it's a string type. You could also add multiple where parameters to that control that would automatically concatenate in its where property using the AND operator. So let's look at example 12 here, and in here you'll see indeed that we have a where clause or where parameters, and there's 3 of them: the ID, the country, and the region. But in the actual links data source element itself, the where clause is simply country equals add country. In this case, even though there are 3 of them defined, the where property is only going to use the country parameter. changing the where property's value at runtime to use any of the predefined parameters based perhaps on a configuration setting by the end user would then be simple to do. The link's data source control also includes a property called the auto-generate where clause, which can simplify the markup created by the control. When you set this to true, the control ignores the value of the where property and automatically uses each parameter specified in the where parameters collection in the query's where clause. That's where you would end up with the ands in there to be able to create that. When defining an order by clause, the wizard creates a comma delimited list of fields as the values for the control's order by property, and that the value of the order by property is then appended to the control's links query when it's executed. The control also exposes an order by parameters collection, which you can also use to specify order by values. However, this is important, in most cases using the simple order by property will be sufficient. You would need to use the order by parameter collection only if you need to determine the value of the variable at runtime, and then the order the query results based on that value. So if you're not changing that in runtime for any reason, there's no reason to actually do that. The link source control also makes specifying a grouping for the data returned by the query easy as well. In the configuration wizard, you saw that we could have selected the group by field for the query. After the field is selected, the wizard then creates a new anonymous type based on the group by field. The type includes two key fields by default. The first is the key, which represents the group object specified by the group by property, and the second is it, which represents the grouped objects. You can also add your own properties to the type and execute functions against the group data such as average, min, max, and count. So if we look at number 13 here, you will see the key and it being used, as well as an average aliased as average underscore unit price. So basically the link data source control here created a new anonymous type containing the key, which was aliased as category in this case, and it, which was aliased as products. It created those two fields. Additionally, the custom property average unit price has been added, which I stated earlier, which calculates the average unit of price per category. When you execute this query and bind the results to a data grid, the simple view of the calculated average unit price is displayed. The category and products are not displayed because they are complex data object or complex object types, and the grid view is not capable of displaying them. So if we actually look at this in the browser, then you can see that we just get the average unit prices. You can access the data in either key by using the standard ASP.NET eval function, as you can see here, and I might point out here as well that this delimiter is for data binding expressions, and basically all data binding expressions must be contained within these particular characters. This delimiter is the opening, the close is the normal closing delimiter as always. But data binding expressions create bindings between a server control property and a data source when a data bind method is called on the page. So you can include data binding expressions on the value side of the attribute value pair, in the opening tag of the server control, or anywhere in the page. But this is how then you would access the data in either key by using the eval function. You can also access grouped items. So let's say if you wanted to include a bullet list for each product in the individual group, you would simply add another template field insert a bullet list control and bind it to the products field returned by the query as shown here. So this would allow you then to access those grouped items. Okay, although the link data source control actually has built-in capabilities for filtering data, these capabilities do not expose the full power that links provides to create queries that include filters. This is where the query extender comes into play. It allows you to define complex searches, data range filters, complex multi-column order by clauses, and even completely custom expressions. And you can see then in this chart the different types of expressions that you can use and a description of what those actually do, and you can look through those on your own. The query extender also works with any data source control that implements the iQueryable data source interface. So in example 14 we actually have a query extender added here. How did we get that added? Before we go into anything else, first of all, it came from the toolbox, the data field again, and the query extender, and you would just need to drag this and drop it on there. You would then connect it to that data source through the target control ID. Then all you have to do is define the filter expressions that you're going to use within the query extender, which has been done in here. So in this case, the query extender is going to look for something that starts with, what it's going to look at is the customer ID. The default value is S, and the query string field or A, and the query field is S. So it would then filter the query results to only customer IDs that start with the value field S. Just like the SQL data source control, the link data source control also allows the data concurrency checks when updating or deleting. The store original values in view state property indicates whether the data source control should store the original data values in the view state. Doing this when using links to SQL, which is what this is based on, the examples we've been looking at, that's what these are all based on, as the underlying data object, that allows the links to SQL then to perform data concurrency checking before submitting updates or deleting data. The downside of this is that the size of your web page will grow significantly, affecting performance of your website if you choose to do this. So you may want to disable the storing of data in the view state, and if you do, recognize that you are now responsible for any data concurrency checking that your application requires, so you'll have to do it programmatically. The control also includes a number of useful events that you can use to react to actions taken by the control at runtime. The standard before and after events for select, insert, update, delete actions are all exposed and allow you to add, remove, or modify parameters from the control's various parameter collections, or even cancel the event entirely. Additionally, the post-action events allow you to determine whether an exception has occurred while attempting to execute an insert, update, or delete. If it has occurred, an exception, then these events allow you to react to those exceptions and either mark the exception as handled or allow it then to continue to bubble up through the application. And we saw that earlier with the SQL data source as well. So like I said, this is a brief introduction to that links data source. We'll talk more about links and creating that in a future chapter here in a couple weeks.